Hey, welcome back. This is probably my last official lesson. It's gonna be due after the 15th. I have to have grades done by the 18th, but this is mostly multiple choice, so it's not too bad for me. And people are doing well or not doing well. I am going to send out a survey, um, like I do every year. I do the survey, and it's the same survey where I ask questions about class, make better, and think about class before March. And I'll ask a few questions about remote learning too. And be honest, it's not. I won't even look at them until after school is over. It won't affect your grade. I just I appreciate your honesty. You're an eighth grade student and you experience it. And what can I do better? Things like that. And what worked, what doesn't work. And then advice for next year's class, which I think is kind of important. Remember, I gave you that sheet at the beginning of the year with the advice. So that's the next thing I'll send out to you, and yeah, and a little goodbye message. But hope things are going well. Let's get into it. This is the last part of Article 3. This is the fun stuff, I think. I think the last one was a little bit tough, the explain how thing. And this I don't think is as tough. It's kind of cool. I really want you to kind of get a taste of what the Supreme Court is about. And we went through the idea that the Supreme Court, only takes like 80 cases, 1% of the cases that are petitioned to them every year. They take the most controversial ones, most important ones. The appellate courts do most of the hard work of deciding whether or not, laws are fair, or executive orders by the president is fair, or, if something that we weren't thinking of was discriminatory or something like that. So they do a lot of the legwork, the appellate courts. And yeah, we went through all that. So let's get into the next phase. Here's the Supreme Court as it stands. The Constitution allows for anywhere from up to the Congress to set up how many judges there are. There's been anywhere from 5 to 12. 9 is a good number because you want kind of an odd number so they can reach decisions. And it's been 9 for probably 100 years. A chief justice is like the person that's in charge. It doesn't really mean that they are like the president of the Supreme Court or something. It's just that you have to have somebody in charge to run the hearings and stuff like that. So there's a few jobs that they have, but when push comes to shove, they have one vote. Just like on the 4 they want to hear, when they look at the cert pool, he gets one vote, and one vote when it's whether they agree or disagree, or if they want to punt it back to the appellate court. So Chief Justice Roberts, he's been on the court since 2005, 15 years. Pretty young guy when he was put on there, I think, by George W. Bush. Yeah, he's the Chief Justice. And the last Chief Justice was Rehnquist, and he passed away. I mean, he was on there until he died. The other ones are called associate justices, but we just call them justices. And most people don't know their names. And again, they're not flashy, so you tend not to. Very rarely do you see them on TV doing interviews and stuff. So, yeah. President nominates them when there's a space available, and then the Senate has to confirm. Justice Garland here, there was a little controversy with that. So, the longest serving one right now is Justice Thomas, who's put on in 91, 93 with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and on and on. To the 2 that were put on by Trump. Good. So this website is the history. It's not a video or anything. It's just kind of cool to look at, I think. To me, it's cool to look at. So this gives you the history. I don't know if I moved it. So yeah, so you can see the 2 that were put on by Trump, which is Kavanaugh, he's the newest one, and then Gorsuch. and they can nominate anyone to be a judge. You don't have to be from the appellate courts, or it can be anybody. There's no qualifications. There's no age. It's a lifetime appointment. You can see the two that were put on by Obama is Keegan and Sotomayor. Alito was put on by George W. Bush, and so was the Chief Justice. Yeah, and you can see that here's Breyer, Ginsburg, Thomas, and again, if you click on these, I think their image comes up. Yeah, and oops, I meant to hit Thomas. So he's the longest serving one, but he's not the Chief Justice. He's very quiet, actually, on the bench. Doesn't say much. These just show like the red ones are always the Chief Justice. So there's Rehnquist. There he is. And these are all the justices through history. I didn't mean to click on them. I'm just trying to move them through. But it is Kennedy, and and the red ones are Chief Justice. And it's William Howard Taft, who was a former president, who was miserable as president but loved being a judge. He was a good one too. And you go through history all the way back to the beginning. I just want to go to the beginning. Here's John Marshall. He's the longest serving justice in American history. And he's the one that probably influenced the court more than anyone else. He was a Federalist, a Hamiltonian, and he kept that branch kind of alive during that time period that he was on. And at his funeral in Philadelphia is where they cracked the Liberty Bell. Just kind of fun. John Jay was the first, George Washington. And you can see there was only 5 justices. So, yeah, it's just an interesting website. You probably don't think it's interesting, but I do. Oops, how you doing? All right, so let's get into some of these a little bit. And again, the Senate has to confirm it, and that was the controversy I was saying with that Obama had nominated someone and the Senate refused to confirm. So the seat remained empty, and Trump was able to put someone on right away. There's a liberal bloc and a conservative bloc. Once you're on, you don't have to be anything. You just have to be yourself. You just be honest. And that's one of the blessings of the Supreme Court, because they don't have to get reelected. But that's why it was so important that Obama's choice, who would have gone to the liberal bloc, was not confirmed by the Senate, which is controlled by the Republicans, because that would have gave them the advantage, and it would have changed things, because the liberals tend to be more equal rights, more small business, little guy, where the conservative bloc are more pro big business corporations, and not rocking the boat too much with old laws and stuff. So they definitely have an advantage, and that's why elections are important, because presidents will nominate. The 2 people that Trump put on are conservative, and like he is, and they're old school, and that's why elections are very, very important. And as judges get older, or they get tired and they want to retire and they leave, you could really end up with these younger people. Kavanaugh is only a little older than me. He's going to be on the court for at least another 20, 30 years. So it can really make a lasting impression. And that's why, elections for the president, for the Senate, are important, because of judges. Not only these judges, but the judges on the lower courts are all appointed by the president too, and confirmed by the Senate. Yeah, I want to go into a couple of them that have done some cool interviews and I know a lot about. And they both happen to be on the liberal bloc, but it's just because I know more about, and I'm dying. They used to be conservative that I always did. Scalia and he passed away. And he was fun, and he was out there, and he would give speeches, and he'd be on 60 Minutes, and but these conservatives really don't. They don't say much. So I don't have much on them to tell you. But the two I'm going to talk about is Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who was put on the Supreme Court by Barack Obama, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I think is an inspiration. And her best friend in the world. I mean, they went over each other's houses. They once a week they would cook and have their families over a house. Was the most conservative. So she's one of the most liberal, and that's Scalia passed away. One of the most conservative, and they were best friends. They went on vacations together and everything else. It's kind of cool. So let's start with Sonia Sotomayor. I'll give you a little more information than the video will about her. This is her. She came over to America. Her parents came over to America from Puerto Rico. She's Puerto Rican. She grew up in the Bronx. This is the best clip. I had a 60 Minutes thing. It won't let me play it anymore because it's evil. And this will let me play it.
I, Sonia Sotomayor, do solemnly swear.
I, Sonia Sotomayor, do solemnly swear.
With this oath on August 8, 2009, Sonia Sotomayor made history and became the first Hispanic judge appointed to the Supreme Court when she was sworn in as the 111th justice. It was the culmination of many firsts throughout her life and career. She became the first Hispanic person appointed to the federal bench in New York, as well as the first Hispanic to ever administer the oath of office to a vice president, as she did for Joe Biden's second term.
Mr. Vice President, please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
But her story began with a lot of hardships on her road to the highest court in the land. Sonia Maria Sotomayor was born into poverty, raised in Bronx housing projects after her parents moved from Puerto Rico in the 1940s. In her best-selling autobiography, My Beloved World, she spoke candidly about the hardships she faced as a child, a juvenile diabetes diagnosis, and the loss of her father at the age of 9. She credited her mother for instilling in her and her brother the power of education, and she exceeded all expectations, earning her high school's valedictorian spot, then summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa at Princeton, then Yale Law, where she served as an editor for the Yale Law Journal. Sotomayor is open and honest about affirmative action playing a role in her acceptance to Princeton, as she recalled, quote, being admitted to the Ivy League through a special door.
And without the kind of affirmative action that I was a part of, which was where it encouraged institutions to look more widely than they had previously, to identify people with promise, then I wouldn't have gotten to the start of the race. And I certainly wouldn't be where I am today.
She began her law career as an assistant district attorney for New York County, and later as an associate and partner at a New York law firm before her historic appointment to the federal bench in New York. She presided over 450 cases, but in one case, she's credited with saving America's favorite pastime. In 1995, she issued an injunction against Major League Baseball owners, a move that ended a 232-day baseball strike. Her confirmation to the U.S. Court of Appeals took more than a year to complete. It also prompted many outspoken Republicans, like Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich and conservative talk show host Rush Limbaugh, to call her a, quote, reverse racist. It all stemmed from a comment she made in several of her speeches. Quote, I would hope that a wise Latina woman with the richness of her experiences would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that life. Despite intense opposition, Sotomayor was confirmed and then served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit for more than a decade. All this before her nomination to the Supreme Court from President Barack Obama in 2009. That controversial comment from her past initially plagued her nomination, but she was eventually confirmed in a 68-31 vote and became the first Hispanic Supreme Court justice. During her time on the bench, Sotomayor has issued sometimes scathing dissents on immigration, police profiling, and women's reproductive health rights. The Supreme Court justice promised in her confirmation hearings not to allow personal biases to influence her rulings. Less than a year after her confirmation to the Supreme Court, the housing projects that formed and shaped her life and childhood are renamed the Justice Sonia Sotomayor Houses and Community Center. Sotomayor has been vocal about how much she appreciates her rich Puerto Rican heritage and the experiences that molded her and the Bronx. And they're proud of her too.
All right, so that's her background, and in this picture here, this is her mom, and that's her brother. And she grew up in a housing project in the Bronx. She talks about in her book, My Beloved World, which is an incredible book about someone beating the odds. How when she was growing up, she would have to get into fights to protect her little brother. And it was a tough world. And she fell in love with Nancy Drew novels and wanted to become a policewoman. That was her dream. And then she was diagnosed with diabetes, a crippling diabetes. She's fought diabetes her entire life, and she knew that the police life would never work for her. So that's when she started to kind of look towards like Perry Mason and to be a judge and study law. And her dad died when she was 9. He was an alcoholic, and it was a tough life when he was alive, even. Her mom was as tough as nails, and had no excuses. Education was the most important thing to save her children from the housing project. Her brother is a doctor. She goes on to graduate top of her class and go to Princeton and stuff. And she talks about affirmative action, and that's just the idea that they have to have so many minority people, and it forces them to look where they don't normally look. Housing project in the Bronx. She's a Yankees fan, and we won't hold that against her. And she when she graduates from Princeton, she tells a story of going into it was a graduation party, and she'd gone into this room to get cheese, and she met this guy who was the Attorney General of New York City, and he was impressed by her and asked her to come on board, and she became Assistant Attorney General, and she was a prosecutor in New York City, which is a tough world, and prosecuting the worst of the worst and putting them in jail. And she did that for a long time. It led to the divorce from her husband. She was smoking up to 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And she looked in the mirror one day and said, I can't do this anymore. I'm starting to hate people. And she left the Attorney General's office and started working for a law firm. She goes through all kinds of stuff at the law firm, being judged as a woman. And being a tough woman, which what they usually call tough women is usually something not very flattering, where they call a man that's really tough and works hard, tenacious, they usually call women something different. And that's part of the prejudice. I've talked about that prejudice with women, and I find it inspirational. And I find it inspirational that her and her mom both wore white, when she was sworn in. Again, that's a tip, a nod to the women who came before them, that marched in the streets. And and they were white. Anyway, so she ends up working for this law firm. That's where she starts to really make money. She's the governor of New York, sees her talent, puts her on this board, which is a Latino board to fight for Latino rights. And then a political thing happens to her. It was Herbert Walker Bush, the first Bush, that put her on the district court in New York City. That's where she makes that decision, I think, on the Yankees. And then Clinton moves her into the appellate court, in 1998, and then Obama nominated her for this ring. So she went right through the federal court system. She grew through it, and yeah, and she is that book. You want an inspirational book? It tells a story of her cousin who died from AIDS, um, the tough life of her mom, and growing up in the Bronx, and overcoming diabetes. She still has diabetes. She's constantly having to give herself insulin shots and stuff. But being able to overcome all that and she does a lot of good work with kids. She thinks kids and education is everything. The 60 Minutes interview is an incredible interview. I can't access it for some reason on my computer. I was able to do it in school, but don't know what's going on. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, I didn't do her before. I used to do Scalia. But I'm not even using my pointer. Scalia. But she's an awesome story because of the fact that she was a women's rights person. She's older. She's 1 year younger than my mom. Sonia Mayer is 65. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 87. 1 year younger than my mom. She grew up in a different world, where it not only Hispanics definitely got prejudice towards them, but Ruthie was just women, massive, and brilliant lady, hard worker. Cool story. Let me show you the clip on her, and then I'll talk a little bit more about her. There's a couple of movies that you ought to see on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's one that it's an autobiography on CNN, and you can watch it on demand. And the other one is a real movie that was out there in the theaters on the basis of sex. All right, let's do the RBG. This is an awesome. This is kind of like a biography documentary that CNN did on her, and this is just the trailer for it, but it's a great story.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
We welcome today Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
She's become kind of like a hero.
Such an icon.
Do you mind signing this copy?
I am 84 years old and everyone wants to take a picture with me.
Notorious RBG. Yeah. When you come right down to it, the closest thing to a superhero I know. Ruth Bader Ginsburg changed the way the world is for American women.
I became a lawyer when women were not wanted by the legal profession.
Thousands of state and federal laws discriminated on the basis of gender. She was following in the footsteps of the battle for racial equality. She wanted equal protection for women.
Men and women are persons of equal dignity, and they should count equally before the law.
She captured for the male members of the court what it was like to be a second-class citizen.
The point is that the discriminatory line almost inevitably hurts women.
I did see myself as kind of a kindergarten teacher in those days because the judges didn't think sex discrimination existed. I have had the great good fortune to share life with a partner truly extraordinary for his generation. He was the first boy I ever knew who cared that I had a brain.
She is a center of power on and off the court.
Every time Justice Ginsburg wrote a dissent, the internet would explode.
I came up with a couple of slogans. You can't spell truth without Ruth.
I surely would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of men and women who kept dreams alive.
I've heard that she does 20 push-ups 3 times a week or something. I mean, we can't even get off the floor. We can't even get down to the floor.
That's her two best friends. Anyway, she's an incredible lady. She's like one of the living women's rights suffragists. I mean, it's really almost to that point. She was just a smart cookie, and she goes to Harvard and Columbia University. She falls in love with her husband, who is also a law student. She gets pregnant while in law school in Columbia, and the two of them kind of get through it together and have the kid. No, they got married before that. I mean, they were married, but it's a love of her life. And he becomes a tax lawyer, and a very famous tax lawyer, and she can't get a job. She graduated above him. No law firm will hire her. It's it's the 1940s and early 50s, and they won't hire women. So she ends up working for the ACLU, and she works for fighting for justice. And she becomes a constitutional lawyer and starts arguing cases for the appellate courts. And it's her husband that finds this case where it's a discrimination against men, and she takes the case and she takes it all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's there where she argues, the fact that's what she says. She feels like she was a kindergarten teacher. She was teaching them how they were holding back women. She makes a name for herself fighting for women's rights in the Supreme Court and winning several cases before the Supreme Court. And then Jimmy Carter puts her on the appellate courts in 1980. And then Clinton puts her on the Supreme Court in 93, and that's where she is now. This movie, On the Basis of Sex, is definitely worth seeing. This is the trailer for it. It's a wonderful story about Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
The fire began to rise.
There are 178 laws that differentiate on the basis of sex. Women can't work overtime. We have to get credit cards in our husband's name.
We're not allowed to work
Can't
in
patrol
mines.
New
This is
York.
You think you can change the country? You should look to her generation. They're taking to the streets.
Protests are important, but changing the culture means nothing if the law doesn't change.
What did you say your name was?
Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I want to be a lawyer. I want to represent clients in pursuit of justice.
So they're going to give you a corner office?
I wasn't what they were looking for. One said women are too emotional to be lawyers. Another told me a woman graduating top of her class must be a real ball buster. I worked hard. I did everything I was supposed to, and I excelled.
Martin Ginsburg will be signing all of our checks someday.
You're a smart girl, Ruthie. You married a star.
If the law differentiates on the basis of sex, then how will women and men ever become equals? I don't read tax court cases.
Read this one.
The law assumes a caregiver has to be a woman. This is sex-based discrimination against a man.
Poor guy.
That's
We
the
need to
case.
take this case.
This is not a case. This is a declaration of war.
It could topple the whole damn system of discrimination.
They think gender equality is a civil right. What's at stake is the American family. Let's put this idea to bed once and for all. You will lose. And when you do, you will set the women's movement back 10 years.
You don't get to tell me when to quit. I know this case disrupted our lives.
Who's it for, if not for me?
You've been ready for this your whole life. So go in there and let the judges see the Ruth Ginsburg I know.
We're not asking you to change the country. That's already happened without any court's permission.
The word woman does not appear even once in the U.S. Constitution.
Nor does the word freedom, Your Honor.
I feel the fire begin to rise.
She is smart and quick, and that's why they say, like, a lot of her dissenting arguments, the briefs that are filed, when they reach a decision, they file briefs, and she's very famous for what she writes, dissenting briefs or in favor, and she's old. Her two kids, both very successful. I know her daughter is a professor at Columbia University, and she takes care of her mom. Her husband passed away about 10 years ago. It was a long, happy marriage. She's pretty fascinating, and I wanted to do that to you because I wanted you to see that the Supreme Court, even though they're something that we kind of don't know, the founding fathers wanted them to be like the protectors of the Constitution. They wanted the people on the courts, the federal courts, and especially the Supreme Courts, to be the founding fathers forever, to be the protectors of the Constitution, be the protectors of democracy, the beacon on the hill for the world to see. And these people are inspirational. And you don't get there out of luck. You get there out of skill, and you deserve to be there. This is the ending, and it's a lot, but I just want to give you this taste. He does a really good job of explaining how the courts kind of work, and it's from Crash Course. So I don't know how much time I have, but I don't really care. I don't know where I put it. I think I put it here. Yes. This guy's pretty good. It's only 6 minutes long.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics. And today, finally, we are stepping into the big leagues. That's right, I'm trying out for the Cubs. No, we're going to talk about how the Supreme Court of the United States actually works. I could try it for the Cubs, right, Stan? Sometimes people refer to it by the unfortunate nickname SCOTUS, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to call it the Supreme Coco, or Coco Supreme. Now, let's just be respectful. So strap in and get ready for some highly technical discussion of procedure as we learn how you, yes you, probably not you, can bring a case to the Supreme Court. The first thing you need to take a case to the Supreme Court is a case, or controversy, and except in certain rare situations where the court has original jurisdiction, that case has to have already been heard and decided by a lower court and appealed. And not just once. Before a case gets to the Supreme Court, you have to have exhausted your appeals at lower levels of the state or federal system. If you've lost your previous appeals but still think that you have an issue worthy of the court's attention, you can petition for a writ of certiorari, which people in the know call the cert, because they're keeping it cash, which is short for casual. For a look at how the court chooses cases, let's go to the thought bubble, or the thubub. A lot of nicknames today, Stan. Or ST. Certiorari is a formal request that the Supreme Court hear your case, but petitioning for a writ is no guarantee of anything. The federal government's chief lawyer, the Solicitor General, is basically like a bouncer at a hot club, if you're old enough to get into a hot club. They screen out a lot of petitions because those cases don't raise a lot of federal law questions, or because they've already been decided in other cases. Or they're not wearing good enough shoes to get in the club. If, and it's a big if, your petition is granted, it goes into the cert pool, the first round in which the justices decide which cases they're actually going to decide.
So
The
that's
list of
where there's
cases
like
that will be
80,000.
decided is called the discussion list. For the judges to actually hear the case, called granting certiorari, 4 of the 9 justices have to agree to hear it. This is called the Rule of 4. The discussion of the discussion list and decision about whether or not to grant certiorari happens at the conference, which is like the back of the club where the really well-dressed people go. So the judges have read your petition, and 4 of them have decided that your case is one of about 80 that they will hear. Congratulations! Now you and the side that disagrees with your position have to submit briefs. Briefs are not underwear. Briefs are written legal arguments from each side explaining why the law favors their position. The party bringing the case seeking to overturn the lower court decision is the petitioner. The party that wants the court to uphold or affirm the lower court's decision is called the respondent. The petitioner also files a reply, which attempts to rebut the respondent, which is not a euphemism. After filing all this, you're finally on your way out of the thought bubble. You're on your way to court. Thanks, the bub. You might think that there would only be 2 briefs in a case, one from each side, and it's true that there must be at least 2. But often there are many, many more briefs, and even boxer briefs. That's what Stan wears. Stan, put your pants on. All undergarments aside, individuals or groups who are not actually parties to the case but have an interest in the outcome can also file amicus curiae, or friend of the court briefs. Amicus briefs often contain different legal, economic, or historical arguments that can sometimes persuade justices and appear in their opinions. They're also one way that interest groups can attempt to influence the Supreme Court. After the briefs have been filed, the court schedules oral arguments, giving them time to read and consider the briefs. Each side gets half an hour to make its case, but this time includes questions from the justices, so most of the time is usually spent answering questions. Imagine a presentation with the most intense teacher you've ever had bombarding you with questions, except that there are 9 teachers. Well, 8, because Clarence Thomas never speaks. After oral arguments, you wait for a decision. The justices then meet in another conference, which is held on a Wednesday or a Friday, because there's good TV the other days. In order for the court to render an official decision, 5 of the 9 justices, a majority, must agree on at least one of the legal arguments that either affirms or overturns the lower court's decision. Although they can also send a case back down to the lower court for another decision, which is called a remand. Although, you might call it a punt. Ooh, that was like 30 yards. The Chief Justice presides over the conference and assigns the task of writing the court's decision, called the majority opinion. The opinions are given in writing, although sometimes justices will read them from the bench. Sometimes the court will issue a single majority opinion, which is a very strong statement of unified agreement. In the key civil rights case of Brown versus Board of Education, the court issued a single opinion that was even stronger because it was unanimous. But sometimes the court will issue multiple opinions on the same case. The decision of the court, either to affirm or overturn the lower court's ruling, is called the holding. And this is the first thing you need to know in any Supreme Court decision. The second thing that matters is the legal reasoning or rationale behind the holding. If a justice agrees with the holding in the majority opinion, but for different legal reasons, they write a concurring opinion. The rationale in this concurrence is cool and everything, but the lower courts do not need to follow it. Only the holding of the majority and its rationale are binding on lower courts. A single justice writes a concurrence, but other justices can sign on to it if they agree with its logic. For instance, the Eagle and I both agree that fish are delicious, but I would write a concurrence that the scales in the eyeballs are gross. It's unlikely this would go to the Supreme Court, though. Let's solve it now. Problem solved. Many Supreme Court cases are not unanimous. In fact, in an ideologically divided court, you are likely to find a lot of cases decided by 5-4 margins. The judges who are on the losing side, who didn't support the majority decision, can write a dissenting opinion. A dissent does not set a precedent for a lower court and has no force of law. But often dissents are very eloquent and they can provide arguments that might persuade later courts in similar decisions. Sometimes, as with the famously bad case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the arguments in a dissent can form the foundation for the majority opinion in a later case, even though it can take 50 years to get from a case like Plessy to Brown versus Board of Education. So that's the nuts and bolts of how Supreme Court decisions are made. But before we wrap this up, here are a few key things to remember. First, there are a lot of hurdles you need to jump over before a court makes a decision in a case. Most certiorari petitions, there are usually about 8,000 each year, don't make it past the clerks or the Solicitor General and don't get granted. It takes 4 judges to agree to hear a case, but 5 to render a majority opinion. Only the holding and the rationale supported by at least 5 of the 9 justices becomes binding precedent for lower courts. Dissents and concurrences may be fun and interesting to read, especially if there are pictures, and they may include important legal ideas, but lower courts don't need to follow them. So that's how the court works procedurally, but there's another way to think about Supreme Court decision-making. To really understand the Supreme Court, we need to consider the thinking behind judicial decisions. But that's for another episode. Thanks for watching. Crash Course.
That's kind of really good. I mean, he does go through a lot. There's a lot of technical terms, which I won't hold you to, but the idea that that's how the Supreme Court kind of works. And we did that already, a lot of that stuff, but that's really it. So that's the end of this lesson. It's the end of my lessons for remote learning this year, but I do want you to do that survey when I send it out. That's important to me as a teacher to be able to reflect and do better, you know? Yeah, so I will talk to you during that survey thing. And yeah, and I think that our work here is done. Make sure you wash your hands, don't touch your face, wear a mask when in public. Be careful, and have a fun and educational afternoon.